Hey there, James.
Hey,
Jimmy.
how are you?
I am doing okay.
It's been a week.
It's been a week. Gosh, seems like more than a week.
Yeah, you're right, it does.
We have of course we have Canvas and certification tomorrow. Um a little bit of questioning about provisional ballots because Allison Riggs's race is so close. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. But got some folks in Mecklenburg who were worried about some student registrations.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah,
But
I'm curious I know it's probably gonna take weeks, if not months, to get the full national readout of everything from mail-in ballots, absentee overseas voting, um,
right.
the bomb scares in Georgia. Um,
Yep.
quite a few things I think may have impacted people going to the polls or getting their votes cast.
Yep. Well, and I think didn't they say that 93 million people in the US didn't vote? Weren't the numbers lower than 2020?
Yeah, I mean the initial,
Yep.
within a couple of days, there were at least 12 to 13 million fewer voters
Yep.
than 4 years ago, which surprised a lot of people. So I'm just kind of curious to see where those numbers were.
Yeah.
I think when people were talking about 12 million short, at that point there were still over 5 million
Yeah,
uncounted in
that's a
California
great
alone,
point.
right? So um
It
I
may end
think
up
it
being
is
a
going
lot
to be,
closer.
yeah. Yeah, I think it'll probably be a little bit less than 2020, but not, it'll be within a million or two, I think.
Yeah, but when you think about population growth since then,
Yeah.
I mean, we had
Didn't,
a lot of people turning 18.
didn't we
Yep.
expect, though, that with a lot of states reducing no questions, absentee, and mail-in voting, that would certainly we
Yeah.
I hope it's not true, but we may never see those voting levels again.
Well, voter suppression works, right?
Yeah. I mean, even in North Carolina, they changed the
Yep.
dates on when absentee ballots would
Yep.
be valid through.
And we had over 5,000 provisionals, and most of those were people who forgot their ID.
Oh,
I don't know
Mm.
about, yeah, but many of them, and some of them were voting in the wrong precinct, but many of them didn't have ID or didn't have the correct ID or had a student ID that was digital that I think the judges finally decided you couldn't use a digital ID and that's the only ones they get. And anyway,
so we were breaking records, at least in Guilford County, we were breaking records for in-person early voting.
Yeah, we
yep.
did in Wake as well. It was off the charts.
Yeah, so I don't know if there was a drop in the mail-in ballots or election day turnout. I don't know where the
Yeah, we had about close to 70% of our eligible voters voted early voting,
yeah.
at least at my precinct. And so come election day, we only had about 2,500 eligible voters left out of like 7,500. And about half of those people showed up on election day.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, like most people, I'll be waiting for Michael Bitzer's numbers at the end of it all.
yeah, yeah, I follow him on numerous accounts and I'm waiting for the numbers.
Yep, he'll be slicing and dicing. And that will be, again, something to add to our report because we want to also talk about the impact of, changes. 2020 is such an aberration because it was COVID year. Um, and pretty incredible in the midst of COVID that, putting up all the plastic screens and all that, they still got the turnout that they did. But 2024 will be somewhat of an assessment of some of the new changes, um, somewhat in terms of, obstacles to voting or
Yep.
ease of voting. So, um,
Will we have a report on uh the effect of voter ID? I mean, how many people showed up and didn't have ID or filled out the exception forms or whatever? I assume we'll get some data on that, right?
Absolutely, they should be, yeah, keeping track of provisional ballots and the reasons for those provisional ballots. Yes. I mean, it's hard to judge any other kind of suppression, like who usually votes absentee and didn't have a copier at home and decided, oh, it's just too much hassle. I'm not going to send in, an absentee ballot because I, can't copy my ID, whatever. Apparently, a lot of people like sent in their actual ID as well.
Ooh,
And the boards of elections are busily figuring out how to return them the driver's licenses and VA cards and such to people.
Will there be a record of those whose absentee ballots didn't make the deadline that still got received?
Yep, there'll be a record of that. Right. So, but yeah, it's kind of hard. We're sending out a newsletter next week, and I've written some of it, but I'm kind of waiting to see how tomorrow goes and what the analysis is there before we just send out a
Sure.
newsletter. But yes, we may not have all the statistics for several more weeks, because then the state has to take all the county stuff and certify that. And I think that date is what, December the 4th or 11th or something. I can't remember.
Yep.
But it's a couple weeks after county canvas.
Okay.
So still more to
So,
come.
yeah, no, absolutely. It'll be interesting couple of weeks.
And Alice, yeah, I'm sure Allison Riggs will ask for a recount.
Yeah.
how close did that end up being? I stopped following a few days ago.
I think it's under 7,000 now, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I knew it was under 10 last
Started
time
at
I saw
10,
it. Yeah.
Yep. But it may be even less. I mean, I know that the data crunchers are looking very carefully, and they'll know more tomorrow.
Okay. Well, good. Well, Steve and I kind of talked a little bit about this earlier this week, Jennifer, and I ginned up a short little agenda, but it's pretty simple. I was going to kind of start, and we dove right into kind of some atmospherics from the election.
Great.
Um,
Go
I
for
know
it.
you had a unique perspective, from your past and where you sit. I was a poll worker on election day. I saw some interesting things, but I thought we just kind of open it up to the group and say, whether you voted or, early voted, whatever, if you saw things, heard things, whatever, I'd be interested to see or hear, take a couple minutes just to get people's feedback on what they saw. Small group, anecdotal, but still interesting to get some atmospherics.
Go for it. Also, just real quick, we did do surveys on the town halls and comments from that and from the network in general. And I'm trying to figure out some way to collate it. It wasn't a whole lot percentage wise, so it may not be that useful, but
Okay,
anyway, that will be part of.
will do. Hey, Mary Ellen, welcome.
Hi. I couldn't find my link.
That's fine. It's been a couple of months, so we're all kind of rebluing ourselves on Zoom. But we're kind of starting here with just some, personal reflections on things you may have seen during the election. Whether that was, standing in line too long, or maybe you heard some things, or we all have kind of unique perspectives on where we sit. But I was just kind of gonna go around the horn and see if anybody saw anything, heard anything that was kind of noteworthy, and we'll kind of start there before we dive into the report. Brad, anything from you?
Not anecdotally from election day. Thankfully, very boring on my end. I voted day
Oh, yeah.
of with my neighborhood precinct area, and I knew most of the poll workers just from living in the neighborhood, and
Great.
yeah, kind of the what you want out of the voting experience. So
Yeah.
I wish I had more. Well, I'm glad I don't have much to contribute. Let me put it that way.
Okay, great. No, that's what we would hopefully everybody would say, but it's not that way. How about you, Ted?
I can give a unique perspective, development from the last time that we met. I ended up running as a candidate, as a write-in.
Okay.
It manifested in late August. I ran as a write-in for the local school board. I will not be asking for a recount because I lost my shorts, as you might imagine. But what it did provide me was an opportunity to go door to door. I live in Surrey County, very conservative and traditional county. And I was surprised, again, anecdotal, how much confusion there still was about voter IDs. And Early voting, we had expanded early voting. The township that I'm in, the last election cycle, all of the early voting had to take place at the county early voting site. This election cycle, early voting took place one precinct in our community. So there were a lot of questions about how and where, but we also experienced the same phenomenon of really, really high levels of turnout for early voting um, for both parties. So
That is a unique perspective, Ted. Wish it would have gone better for you, but it sounds like it was a pretty interesting experience.
I wasn't surprised. How about that?
Great. Mary Ellen, how about you? Any insights or reflections?
Well, I didn't have anything very unusual here. I mean, everything went very smoothly. I did early voting and it was brisk. But on election day, the turnout, just observing the precincts, that I encountered during the day, they were not crowded at all. And yet our vote turnout was quite good for the county. But I ran across something really strange that I think does kind of tie into this committee. It was a discussion with some people who tend to entertain the idea of conspiracy theories having some value. And it was about I cannot remember the man's name, but he is well known. It's a CIA conspiracy where they have ghost registrations, and supposedly they can get through to our state level voter rolls and behind the scenes create these mail-in um, constituencies. I mean, they're using people with valid addresses, and the people request mail-in votes that go to their addresses, and the votes are mailed back in, but somehow don't register in the system. And if they're needed to get the particular candidate over the line, on election night, they are pushed up. Well, that, kind of blew my mind. That was before the vote. But what really blew my mind is yesterday, this same group of people started talking to me about this again. And it seems that they have encountered an explanation that Kamala Harris was going to be the recipient of these votes, but the elites, that's the term that they use, decided at the last minute that Trump might actually be easier to work with on some of their issues. And they didn't use the ghost system. And I was like, oh my Lord. I mean, not only are they spreading conspiracy theories, but now they're following up and explaining how it worked out the way it did. And I mean, I had just never encountered anything like that. I was just floored. And what in the world, how do we counteract anything like that? I just don't get it. And I don't know if you all ran across the articles in one of the British media outlets where they did some research. It was a particular reporter who called about 1,000 people individually and spoke with them. And what his research showed was that the buy-in to the disinformation was so firm that when the disinformation was corrected, they saw that as the disinformation rather than the actual information that was put out at first. And, I don't know how you all think, but to me, I just don't know how we can ever turn this type of thing around. I mean, it just seemed to be that whoever gets there first with whatever their information is if it's believed, then the counteract just doesn't work. And that is a hard thing going forward. A hard world, I guess, to live in, where that is the case, where facts just don't work anymore. But that was my big takeaway from this, that it wasn't about ballot security. It was more about what was being said about ballot security and that type of thing. So that's what I walked away with. Just blew my
Interesting.
mind.
Steve, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm in Guilford County with Mary Ellen, so we saw probably the same early voting
Yeah.
system anyway. I'll say that I hear about the people you're talking about, Mary Ellen, online. I don't have any personal interaction with them, so apparently you know more interesting people than I do.
Steve, they're really good friends. I don't know what to say.
um, but for me, what I saw from voting, I went, you know, maybe on the second day of early voting, I think. Um, and I went to a different site that I normally go to. I think it's kind of nice that early voting you can go anywhere. So I got my son and my wife, and we all went down and went to early voting together. And we went to a different place because it was near a new ice cream place we wanted to try, so important reasons. But it was packed on the second day. We waited about an hour, a little bit over an hour in line. I've never had to wait like that in Guilford County before. Um, if I had remembered that they have that online live wait time that you can get off the web, we might have picked a different location because GTCC was not busy at all. But it was very busy. What I saw, it worked very smoothly. There were no problems. There were, I don't know if they're supposed to do this or not, but when they were checking people in, they were kind of loudly commenting on, oh, first time voter for certain people. Um, and there were a lot of those. So that was really encouraging. Um, And that was kind of what I saw. After that, it was all just following reports and things online. I shared a news story with James. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that while we were here or not,
You
but
can absolutely, Steve. I think, yeah, if you want to bring that up, I think it is very prescient.
well, it was I think what I've seen thinking about election security and cybersecurity of elections, there was a lot of that. People talking about voting machines and voting machine companies after the 2020 election. And it seems to have mostly died down. There's very little of that now. But a lot of the mistrust seems to have shifted over to, and this, I guess, ties into what Mary Ellen was saying, that it goes over to the voter rolls. And in particular, I hadn't heard the ghost ballot thing before, but a lot of people are talking about non-citizens voting, and there is apparently a group in North Carolina that is organizing and challenging voters in mass. Now, in North Carolina, you have to challenge them individually. So when I say in mass, they're not sending in 50,000, but like it seems like it was 1,000. I could pull up the story, but it seems like there was hundreds up to maybe 1,000 ballots in some county that were being challenged by people who were, looking through the voter rolls. And I don't know if this was in the story that I sent James or in a different thing, but one of those, the reporting was that the group that was doing this was telling people look specifically at Hispanic sounding last names. So I don't know how that's going to turn out in the end, but I think it's interesting that people don't really talk about the cybersecurity aspects of the actual voting process anymore, but they are very concerned about the roles, and there's a lot of mistrust about the roles. The news story maybe a month before the election, and it hit the national news that talked about over 100,000 people being removed from the North Carolina voter rolls.
Mhm.
And the way the national story was written, it sounded like somebody just went in and did that immediately. But if you actually read the story, it was,
Yeah.
regular
Over
voter roll
time, yeah.
maintenance over
Yeah,
the
it was like
last
20
week.
months worth of work.
Yeah, right. But I think that kind of headline gives people mistrust and makes them think, well, the
Absolutely.
voter rolls were way off, and people are finding all these 100,000.
Well, Stephen, I know that our Board of Elections was trying to take steps to make certain people understood that it was routine.
Right.
Um,
Right. And there were a lot of quotes that said that, but if people didn't read past the headline, and I think a lot of people didn't read past the headline, they got a bad impression.
Yeah, absolutely. Jennifer, I thought I saw you maybe come off mute. Did you have a follow-up there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, I think, a great analysis of the change in voter confidence, because when you look at, even though we didn't get a whole lot of feedback from the trust election tour, we did get 75 answers, and many answers said, I can see that the internet, cybersecurity, ballot security is not an issue, right? A lot of people, that's just not the focus, whereas it was in 2020. Or sorry, 2022. We didn't do a thing in 2020. In 2022, on trust elections, like the cybersecurity expert was like key to all of those town halls. Like that was, people were so worried about the machines. Very different now. You're absolutely right. The non-citizen voting, that whole myth got out there, and it aligned well with the anti-immigrant perspective of one of the campaigns. And that was one of the things, the voter rolls. Interesting that the concern evaporated when people saw which way the votes went. But there were in Mecklenburg, there were a few issues, and across the state, there were 2 precincts that had printing problems, had to keep voting late. There were complaints of intimidation with people getting too close to the campaign, the door, that getting past the campaigning sign. We had to have the Board of Elections move some people around at one of our voting sites that wasn't really well set up, because it wasn't clear where people could campaign and where they couldn't. We even heard this in the trust elections tour, that most of the problems come from campaigns who don't tell their workers. You can't harass people, you can't jump, go after them, you can't. So that's, again, not atypical. I don't think it was anything any more than usual. We didn't have any reports of weapons that I've heard of. I mean, maybe the Board of Elections did, but I have not heard anything. And we had people around the state kind of, reporting anything unusual. But the non-citizen issue was also manifest in the signs that were put out in Spanish. That in Spanish said that if you're not a citizen, you cannot vote. It's a felony. You're going to get deported. And that was not officially put out by the Board of Elections. It was put out by the North Carolina Election Integrity Network, which has got its Facebook page, etc. And some precinct judges did remove those because they were not official signs, and they were judged to be intimidating and threatening. And there was a lot of confusion as to the whole voter rolls and non-citizens and that kind of thing. We also had some students who went to vote, who were told they weren't registered when they had somebody on campus doing registrations like weeks before that. And so there's some concern about whether the database that they were using at the polling sites was up to date, or whether somebody took registrations and didn't turn them in, or it's one of those things. But it wasn't a huge amount. So I'll wait to hear from Karen Brinson Bell, kind of their assessment from all their election directors of how things went. But overall, yes, it was peaceful. And some of the worst fears that we had did not come to pass. And some of that may be because things went, at least for the presidential election, things went the way a lot of the people who were propagating myths, things went their way, so they dropped them. But there is still one race that's very close, statewide race, and we may see some more stuff from the Allison Riggs judicial race. We'll wait and see. But luckily, everything else was, election workers say, please let it be a landslide. And none of the other statewide races were that close, which was interesting. So
I
Well,
do have one more thing along these same lines that I felt like I should have had the answer to, and maybe one of you does have it. It was the same thing. It was looking at the voter rolls with early voting, and here, I don't know if everywhere, but here we could vote anywhere we wanted to. And the question to me was, well, how in the world, if you can vote anywhere, why can't I just vote in 4 sites, one right after the other? Why can't I do that? They would never know if nothing is connected to the internet. Well, of course, I knew that the voter rolls could be connected to the internet, but I didn't know if they could actually do it in real time and whether every site had every voter in the county in it. And I just didn't know how to answer that, but that was one of the approaches again that I'd never heard that before. That was what they wanted to know. Does anyone have an answer to that? Do you all know?
yeah, so as a poll worker who's done early voting,
Good.
during early voting, during election day, if you go, they have a poll book there. You can go to one site that has your
Right.
registration, and they take the sticker and they put it on your ATV, and then you go get a ballot. In early voting, they actually look you up in the database, which is online the entire time you're early voting. So you're connected to the county website, so they can track the entire county's worth of voters. And then if you're not in the county, then you would come up as unknown, and you'd go over, we'd help you on another computer, and we'd figure out, are you in the wrong precinct, in the wrong county, and kind of figure out where you are. But that database is online the entire time. And so we always try to
Okay.
make the distinction with voters that that computer, which is tied to the voter rolls, is not a voting machine. So therefore, you can't say that a voting machine is tied to the internet, because it's not a voting machine. And we go in there and make sure when you vote, we go in there and find you, it's updated so everybody else in the county sees that that person has been accounted for at that single polling site.
Okay, now, James, that brings to the next issue. The voter rolls are on the internet. And what is to stop someone from inserting someone new in those rows,
Yeah,
particularly
that,
the CIA?
it's a great question. I mean, that gets back to, kind of one of the roles of this committee is understanding cybersecurity, and those roles, as you know, they're not publicly available, the roles themselves, so they're heavily protected by the county sites. I don't know, Stephen, if you have any additional. I think, that's really the one section as we kind of look at our paper that we're writing, our report. That's kind of the smallest part of the report that's in there, and that, we've kind of talking here, seems to be where most of the questions are on the
And
security
it's
side, is how do we secure the voter rolls?
it's a number thing too. In my head, I felt like we're keeping track of how many people are in there. And if someone starts inserting, it's going to be noticeable, but I didn't know how to explain that. Because that was another huge discussion on a different time, but with some
Absolutely.
of the same people.
Steve, any insights
So
there?
I'll say something about those in kind of the backwards order. The inserting things, there's a public readout on the number of ballots that have gone through the tabulator, not just not the votes for individual candidates, but they do check that against the number of people that were checked in at the front desk, and each person checked in at the front desk is marked off of a voter roll. And so the people that voted that day, the number of people that voted at that site, and the number of ballots that were submitted into the tabulator, and all that has to match. As far as the security of the rolls themselves, the active database is not publicly accessible. The rolls themselves are. Every week North Carolina dumps those out to publicly downloadable files. I've got them on my laptop right here that lists every voter and where they voted and when they voted and all that kind of information. And anybody can do that, and people do that. Jennifer mentioned the North Carolina Integrity something project. I think that's the group that's challenging the voters in that county. But they're pulling those rolls and looking at them and making sure, at least as much as they can, that those are actually real people, that they're not fake voter identities that are just put in. Now, what stops somebody from we had a town hall in Forsyth County, and that was the one town hall where we had somebody on the panel that was that worked with the county board and was a little conspiracy minded.
I remember that night.
Yeah. And he said he was just waiting for somebody to show up to vote where somebody had already voted in their name, that there was going to be a class, and that never happened, right? And he was surprised that that never happened. So what's going to stop somebody from finding somebody in the public voter rolls that doesn't regularly vote but's in the rolls anyway and just using their name to vote? So first off, voter ID should stop that. But second off, I think most people are really aware that there's serious penalties for that, and so they just don't do it. They just don't try it because there's a good chance they're going to get caught and go to jail.
And I think that happened in Florida. I think Florida has the election police, and they did. I think they arrested a couple people who voted who were turned out to be not registered, not citizens, whatever. But I was gonna also say, in terms of the voter rolls, if you were going to create a bunch of people, you'd have to create social security numbers for them, addresses for them that can be verified, that the postal service goes to, a photo of them that can be verified and can be in a document that's verifiable, that they see as a picture. So, I mean, that's an incredible amount of work to create fake people to put on a voter roll. And the idea of doing that for hundreds of people, I mean, that's only happens in spy novels, right?
But Jennifer, in this case, it is the CIA that is creating this. And the CIA can do it. So, I mean,
I remember
I was defenseless. I couldn't do it. I couldn't come up with anything.
Well, and James may have an anecdote as well, but I worked for the State Department for 4 years, and we used to read some of the conspiracies about what people thought the US government could do. And I remember thinking to myself, when you've done an interagency process of any kind, thinking, if only we were that effective.
Yeah. So yeah, we're not coordinated enough in the U.S.
Exactly.
government
Yeah,
to do a huge conspiracy.
I was going to say exactly the same. Anybody who's worked on the inside of one of those agencies knows just how many offices need to sign off on anything before you could manage to get a single thing.
I would say the U.S. government would be the worst organization to try to do something like that effective.
Well, I'll try that next time it comes up.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, from my perspective, a couple points. So election day went really well, like in most places. I'm in Apex, so we're generally fairly small when it comes to precincts. Don't generally get a ton of throughput. That said, the early morning for us was pretty busy. Up to about 10, 11 o'clock, it was nonstop. We opened the door and had probably 100 people in line. And we opened at 7:30. It was a long day, like it always is. For the most part, the day went really well. I generally get, I'd say maybe 1 to 5% people who come in and comment about voter ID. And usually the comment is, I'm really glad we're doing this. We should always do this. It should have always been the law of the land. Like, okay, your comment didn't really do anything, but great. But that usually goes really well. The one negative we had happen for us was actually on the outside and not the inside. So we all know about election observers. We had one from each party most of the day inside our polling place, and they were great. They were a non-issue, and even though now you can move around, they generally didn't. They stayed in their little area and just kind of watched. Occasionally, they would talk to the chief judge because they knew they really weren't supposed to talk to us. And they were a non-issue. They were very pleasant. Both of them were, and actually, like the the Democrat, she was there all day. I was like, what short straw did you draw to? But she was with us like for 12 hours. Um, but outside was a different story. And so this was the first year, maybe they've been around before, where we had people that had been identified as external observer or outside observers. Um, Now they called them that, but to me, they just look like partisans. They didn't have name tags on, but supposedly their campaigns had identified them as outside observers. They had a little spot. And the hard part about our precinct, we were in a school gymnasium that was fairly large. And so our entrance, which is protected by the 50-foot buffer, was great. No issues there. Our exit, however, which was a long ways away from our entrance, was not protected by that 50-foot buffer. So we actually had partisans from both groups standing right outside the door. And the worst part was actually the Democrats they had a group there, and one lady was standing and stopping every voter as they came out to query them on their voting experience. And literally was standing in the door. So when you walked out, you were going to walk into her if you didn't stop. And there are some people actually a lot of people who don't want to talk to anybody when they come out of the voting place. They just voted. It may have been a significant event for them. They just want to get back in their car and go home. But she basically was interviewing everybody that came out, how your voting experience was, what went good, what went bad. And we kind of felt on the inside. Eventually, our chief judge went and talked to her a little bit just to kind of move back towards the grass. But we kind of felt that she was trying to tease out that we inside were treating different voters differently. And that was kind of feedback we got from people, is that we weren't treating everybody the same. Not everybody was getting the same voting experience. We had no clue what was driving this line of questioning. That seemed where it was going. And that was pretty much from the Democratic external observers. The Republican people on the outside, which I'm not sure if they were external observers or just on the campaign side. Again, our exit, even though it was 100 yards away from our entrance, was on the same single sidewalk that connected to the entrance. And so when the Republicans stood on that sidewalk, she was actually blocking the sidewalk for people walking to get to the entrance. And so they had to walk around her to be on the sidewalk. So eventually we went out and said, you guys need to be in the grass, because they were just getting in the way of voters. You can talk to them, whatever, but they were actually impeding people walking to vote. And so those are the only issues that we saw. A lot of it was after people voted, so it wasn't necessarily the voting process, but one could argue sort of reverse intimidation, knowing that there's going to be something waiting for you when you exit the polls, can kind of put a sense in your mind that not everything's right. Last point on sort of the conspiracy. And so I saw it a little bit building up sort of from the right on technical things and how tabulators work. And a lot of comments were, in my book, not something we can apply to North Carolina, because thankfully we have, one paper ballot for every voter. So there's always a way to do audits after the fact, and see what a single person voted all the way through the process. Not every state is like that. I'm guessing. The way I heard a lot of comments is there's some states that don't necessarily have a paper ballot for every voter, which led to a whole line of conspiracy thinking on, well, tech people can get into the voting machines and change numbers. Where I saw that transition post-election, like literally within 24 hours, were from the left, and all the money that tech billionaires put into the election. I mean, Elon Musk was very vocal about, and they've, have done analytics now, about 125 million they think he put into the campaign. And so between, him, Bezos is another big media guy, big billionaire, who all, congratulated the winner a day after. And so now on the left, the thinking is, well, these big tech entrepreneurs who have all this money, they basically own the internet, they could go in and change numbers. And they did it, so that's sort of the things that I saw on the back end, which, tying back to our report, gets back into people don't understand necessarily how the tabulator works, how voting gets validated after the fact, all the curation that goes on. And so, I think that may cross a couple of different committees in our commission, and not just the cyber one, but there's a level of knowledge that is missing. But that was my feedback.
Let me add something. You mentioned other states, and so the few stories I heard about other states and complaints about election equipment were people that used the ballot marking devices and they weren't calibrated.
The express votes.
Yeah, and so they were either they were touching on the wrong part of the screen, or and it wasn't
Yep.
registering or something. And I know that we have counties I mean, everybody has those machines in North Carolina for ADA compliance.
Yep.
And I think Mecklenburg uses them for everybody. Is that true, Jennifer? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
we use them for everybody.
I didn't hear any of those complaints in North Carolina. I heard complaints in other states, and the good thing was they were very quickly sort of tamped down because the complaints almost were all in sort of Republican leaning areas. And when the Republican, elections director came out and said, yes, we walked them through it and they were not using the equipment correctly or something like that, then all of a sudden people believed it. But there were stories of machines flipping votes, and they were clearly not.
We actually had 3 incidents of that on one of the early voting sites in Mecklenburg. They got their ballot, the printout as they were walking over to the tabulator. They said, "I didn't vote for Jill Stein. I wanted Harris." And turns out that the way that the ballot went down, of course, was Josh Stein and Jill Stein. And what the chief judge determined was that people had somehow gone too quickly and thought they were voting for Josh, voted for Jill, canceled out the Harris vote, and so they were given new ballots. But it was, again, it was that conspiracy of the ballot machine, the machine's not working correctly, it's flipping votes. And according to the Carter Center, that is a concern that has been out there for, decades. That and it just, because they test every machine and they audit every machine and they certify it, it's very unlikely that that happened.
Well, if it was 3 complaints out of how many ever there were in Mecklenburg County, that's not very significant. Has Mecklenburg talked about going to hand-marked ballots? I know it's a big enough county where it would be very expensive to just sort of change out equipment. But do you know if they talk about that?
No, there are 7 counties that actually use ballot marking
Yeah.
devices. And I don't think any of them are talking about getting rid of that, because they have the paper backup and they tell people to look and make sure it printed out correctly. And yeah, I don't think they're going to change that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think in my precinct, we processed 1 express ballot the entire day. So that's
Jennifer,
about,
can you say again, is that decision for Mecklenburg and for the other counties, is that just the cost-effective way to approach the problem? We have to have the equipment for ADA compliance, so we might as well make it available to everybody to use, and then we've got one system that voters experience? Or is there another
Well, there are a
reason?
couple things. I mean, yes, if people have arthritis or hand problems, whatever, in a county like Mecklenburg, we get over 5,000 provisional ballots, right? So in a county like Mecklenburg, the number of handicapped people is going to be huge. We've got over 800,000 voters, and so yeah, part of it is just knowing how many people out there need assistance. Speed of voting, it's much faster than having to bubble in each of the things, especially on a long ballot. And so I think it's really an efficiency issue.
That was part of our recommendation in the other committee that I sat on for voter accessibility was the industry standard that if you voting or otherwise, generally when you make accommodations for folks with disabilities available, there's actually a broader population who benefit from those opportunities for a myriad of reasons. And so it sounds like
I've seen my mother-in-law cannot fill in an oval. She's 91 years old, right? She just can't do it. So last time I did curbside voting with her, I had to fill in the bubbles. This time we did an absentee ballot and I just filled it in, read everything to her and filled it in. But you're exactly right. There are a lot of people who just don't have the ability to hand mark.
yes, that's an interesting comment, because one last anecdote from my day at the precinct. We had a voter show up. She parked in one of the handicap spots right next to the exit door to walk around, and she gets out with her walker and she's coming in, and one of the external observers went over her and started encouraging her to do curbside voting. And so that got our judge's attention really fast. And we almost had to have that guy removed because we're like, look, you can't encourage people in the voting process. That's actually where you're crossing the line, especially as technically an observer, you really need to be careful. But she wanted to come in and vote in person. And he was out there like standing in front of her while she's getting out of her car, trying to say, "Oh, you should just stay here. They'll come out and take care of you." And again, another way where someone is influencing the voting process that shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I'll point out, I saw one thing kind of related to the disabled voters, not necessarily disabled, but that I had never seen before. And I thought it went really smoothly. They let a voter that came into the early voting site who I said I stood in line for over an hour, right? And she would not have been able to do that. So what they let her do is they had a chair up at the front of the line and she sat there and they sort of marked her position in line and she could stand up when her position came by and then walk right in. And so she was just sitting there as everybody went by and I chatted with her for a while. She was really nice. But I thought that was an interesting way of accommodating somebody that couldn't stand for an hour.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does everybody have outside observers? I mean, I went by 4 precincts on election day and I didn't see that anywhere.
I had never heard of them before.
I haven't.
I just saw them as partisans, and I don't know how you could tell the difference.
Well, I mean, we have the, campaign people outside, but they're not official in any capacity. They're just, they don't even have 2 people for the same office lots of times. So, I've never seen anything like that, thank goodness.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not sure. Like I said, they called themselves external observers. They had a gaggle of 4 or 5, but there were no name tags. They weren't registered like internal observers were. So I'm not really sure what official means because I thought it was kind of hokey.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if they just coined that phrase maybe instead of just being campaign volunteers, because I mean,
Yeah,
you have to
my
understand that, but
my chief judge was familiar with the concept. So to me, it sounds like there had been discussions that this was going to be a thing. And there were a group of them. There were like 5 or 6 at any given time who were there. And it seemed like on the Democrat, their specific mission was to talk to people when they came out from voting. That's how they were observing.
that's interesting.
So very intrusive. But that said, I know we've only got 5 or 10 minutes left. And so real quick, I just want to pop up the where we are in the status of our report. Again, I think we're really close. And real quick before I do forget this, Jennifer, what is our suspense for final submissions?
Suspense? You mean timetable?
Yeah, to turn them in, when we're final.
Yeah, so we are trying to get those finalized by, the holidays, December. Because we're going to be getting the full report in pretty form and all that in January. We have that final meeting February the 4th. I hope everybody has on your calendar because Judy Woodruff is going to be the keynote speaker. And that's going to be really interesting. She's going to give us her analysis of the election. I think that's what her topic will be. But anyway, so as long as we get it done by, Christmas, that's really, I think, what we're looking for. And we have to, as I said, I'm collating sort of responses from the survey and from the town halls and that kind of thing. I'm still working on that. Bob's going to take a hand at kind of looking through things from a legal perspective. Our professors are going to look through things for, annotations and format and that kind of thing. So we'll be doing that, throughout November, December, and finalizing it in January. So if we get that done, yeah, by December. And also think about if there's any appendix that you want, any kind of report that you think is really pertinent to North Carolina, that we want to add at the end, because we may have several appendices, like, yeah. There's also, I know that Ted has been a big proponent of ranked choice voting. I mean, we could add in, 5 states, ballot initiatives turned it down. And I can't remember which the states were, but there things like that we can kind of, in terms of results from this year, kind of indicate some of the things that we're talking about.
Okay, no, that's perfect. And then we'll shoot internally, probably mid-December. We'd like to put a bow on this and get it to the team so they can start looking at it. So we'll work towards that. As I prefaced earlier, the section that I'm showing on the screen that's highlighted is really sort of that hanging chad, pun intended, for really to kind of close out. I think for the most part, our report is in really good shape. But this one section we had identified as a focus area and a concern, and initially generically we had it as, understanding how ballots are processed and counted, knowing that I believe there's another committee kind of looking at, ballots themselves. So we were kind of crossing the streams there a little bit. After hearing some of the concerns pre and post election, I'd kind of thrown in a recommendation to maybe be more specific in our titling of the concern, because I think there is a digital component to this and a knowledge gap on people understanding how voting machines are secured, as well as voter lists themselves being secured digitally and the concerns with those, and explaining how that works. Maybe a better way to flesh out this topic. But I'll probably, across the group, and we can put it out in the email to the larger group, this is probably the section that I want to focus on the next 2 or 3 weeks and see if we can kind of flesh out and complete. And I think, mid-December, we can do kind of a final review between Steve and I, and then push it off to the processors. And so I'll pause there for any comments, feedback. Steve, anything to come over the top with?
Yeah, actually, you say this is the part that needs, I think this is actually pretty good as it is. I did go through earlier, James, and I tagged some things earlier in the document that were repetitive. I don't know if you saw that.
Yep.
I think the audits and the random, yeah, that part. I think
Yeah.
the audits in randomly chosen precincts to sort of verify the integrity is an important thing to be included. Doesn't have to be included 3 times. But I actually thought about that. The reason I noticed the repetition is I thought about it when I was reading the section on how ballots were counted. And then I thought the audits would be really good here. And so I searched the document and found it in the other places. So I think that's a really important point. I don't know the right place to put it, but that was really the only comment I saw as I read through everything. I think it's in good shape personally.
Yeah, I think it's really close. I know, people, everybody's busy. I want everyone to have a chance to kind of look through things and, make this not a me and Steve document, which is not. We've had help from everybody, but I just want people to make sure they're fully vested in the outcome and take a chance to review. If we think we're good, then we will go. I think we've put together some pretty good work up to this point.
If I can ask a question, probably more your bailiwick, Steve, but anybody who knows, as I looked at your question, James, about chain of custody from a digital standpoint that you shared with us in your email that brought us together, I didn't have a lot to stand on, so I read a little bit from several sources, and it seems like there's like a logical part of this, which is not just chain of custody, how data is handed from one to the next, but also how to avoid intrusions on the data or encroachments on the data. And Stephen, I came across several references to digital hashing that is germane to when information is copied. So this would be in the after phase of an election. So after the ballots are counted and when they are inventoried for whatever the statutory period of time is. Can you talk about what that hashing process is and whether that's relevant to what we're trying to address with chain of custody, and maybe whether we do that in North Carolina already?
So yeah, so technically hashing is basically just a function that's computed on a large set of data that gives it a small, some people call it a fingerprint, some people call it a message digest or a hash,
Like a checksum.
a checksum. I avoid that because checksums are something that goes back to sort of random communication errors, not malicious errors. Checksums are easy to forge. Cryptographic hashes are not. Um, and how it's used in there's several ways that it's used. I don't know every way that it's used in the voting systems. I know, for example, that the software is all hashed. When the machines are certified, the particular software that's in there is hashed. And so people can check that hash. If the data changes at all, that hash won't match anymore. And so the software is checked that way to make sure the software hasn't been tampered with. Um, and the configuration, the thumb drives that they use, they're hashed, and then there's a digital signature on top of that, which is another step um, that sort of verifies the integrity. So there are technical measures that, um, if I had a way to forge a hash, the same exact hashes they use in these things, it's also the same exact hash that they use to protect Bitcoin. I would be a billionaire if I could crack that. So,
Roger. And so it sounds like that is part of our um, technological protection that we already have here in North Carolina.
yeah, it's sort of a digital version of a tamper evidence seal, the little
Right.
tape they use on physical access.
Right.
Can
Great.
we put that in the report somewhere? Those are really cool terms. Like checksum and hash. I mean, that's no,
Sure.
just because I think it's just one more detail that shows folks how secure things are. If we can find out which things are protected, with that ultra digital protection, just to put that in the report somewhere.
Yeah, and Jennifer, that's fair because as I tried to think about this as a bit of a layperson, I tried to think about, well, what are people going to be suspicious of? And those data ports, the spot where the information comes back out of at the end of the voting day, that would be some place that someone who is suspicious could also assume, well, somebody could peel that tamper detection device away and stick a different USB port in there. And it did seem helpful for me to understand if somebody asked me about it, that there are ways to, thank you, Stephen, make clear that the software has not been tampered with. Even though the system is offline, the software still has not been tampered with by virtue of somebody plugging a media device into the machine to begin with, or at some point in the process.
No, that's great. I think there's a whole line of questioning from people who don't understand on, your ballot goes into the tabulator, it all of a sudden becomes digital and can be manipulated, and all the numbers can be manipulated. And I mean, I've, as someone who stands by the tabulator for hours and knows how secure the process is, it's hard to dissuade people when there's a concrete misunderstanding of how the technology works. Even though you can hear your ballot fall to the bottom of the machine, so your paper is still in there. People are like, no, it becomes a computer, and I don't trust it.
We had a question at one of the town halls that nobody had ever asked before, and it made me sort of take a double take, but it was a really good question the way it was asked. They were asking about how the totals from the tabulators were reported. And we talked about, you get the results tape printed out, blah, 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 blah. And they asked simply, is it reported in a human readable form? And I thought, well, I know it is. I wouldn't have thought anybody, but I guess somebody could question. Maybe it's in some sort of like a QR code that doesn't make sense to a person, and then something's hidden in there, right? But it's just a text readout that the election workers and the officials can view and read and make sense to a human. You don't have to trust the the computer. And nobody ever asked that. And I hadn't really thought, well, why would you print it in a computer only form? But it might be worth saying.
Yeah, I remember we did it during the municipal elections last year in 23. I think we may do it during primaries. I mean, when we were done at election day, they took the tape, they taped it to the door on the outside of the polling place,
Yeah.
so the partisan could come and read the results that night. So, I mean, we put the data out there and people still don't trust that it's a human readable. It's, yeah. But okay, that's all I had to talk about, and we pretty much hit our time almost to the minute. So we didn't necessarily plan that, but it worked out pretty well. Stephen, any follow-ups? Jennifer?
No, you guys have done a great job of getting this put together and asking some of the tough questions. And I think yeah, it's pretty close to being ready. The other thing I want to just mention is don't worry about if you covered an issue, another committee covered the issue, because there's going to be some crossover. We'll look through it all in a whole and see if there are too many redundancies. But a lot of times, there are different ways of looking at the same issue based on whether it's cybersecurity or something else, election day process or whatever. So sometimes you have to cover it in both, but don't worry.
Great. Steve, any follow-ups?
James,
go ahead.
may I tell one quick anecdote?
Yeah.
To maybe feel good about for the group. And Jennifer, if you have an opportunity, I hope that you'll share this with Dr. Cooper. The day before the election, my daughter went to Raleigh to the School of Science and Math, which was holding a free for everybody high school age ethics and leadership and the implications of data and democracy forum.
Nice.
And Dr. Cooper presented at that. And they had nice panels and roundtables. And my daughter said that there were 300 kids from all over the state who participated in that. So thanks to Dr. Cooper and for all of you for trying to help another generation make this better and better.
That's great. The School of Science and Math. Well, a lot of those people are going to be doing what Cooper and Bitzer do, and slicing and dicing the numbers.
It was neat.
My polling place was the Math and Science Academy in Apex.
Oh, there you go.
Nice.
Yeah. So it was a pretty cool facility.
That's a great school.
It is a great school.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that is all I have. You guys have a great rest of your night, great weekend. Steve and I will get together and kind of start working through, nugging through this for the next couple of weeks, and we'll reach out to the group and kind of go from there.
Great. I made a few notes on things like Ted's comment about, putting something about cryptographic hashes. So maybe I'll look at this and I'll think about a way of, if I can find a way to put in something that makes it sort of brings all the different things of logging changes and integrity of physical, digital ballots, sort of put that all under an umbrella and bring it together. But I think we're almost there. And I'll be in touch, James.
Sounds good. You guys have a great rest of the night and a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well.
Thank you all. Have a good one.